Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, an exploration of strategy, leadership, technology, and entrepreneurship. Your host, Nectar, is the co-founder and partner at the PNR, a strategy consulting firm based in Montreal.
Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to another episode of the Point of No Return podcast. On today's show, I had the pleasure of speaking with Liette Lamonde, Managing Director of Startup Montréal. A little bit of background on Liette. Prior to the merger of Montreal Inc. and Bonjour Startup, she was the Executive Director of Montreal Inc., whose mission was to guide young Montreal entrepreneurs down the path to success. And she's been an active player in the role of philanthropy since 2004, when she was appointed CEO of. Was also the co-founder of Bonjour Startup Montréal, an organization created in collaboration with OSMO to encourage connections between all players of the startup community. And we really dive into all things startup on today's episode. As you can see, Liette is really passionate about entrepreneurs, helping entrepreneurs. So really think about how do we build communities for startups in Montreal. We spoke about obviously taking over the role of Managing Director of Bonjour Startup and her vision, her new strategic plan for the organization, the art of bringing people together, the unsung art. We spoke about the merger and really some interesting concepts around the values that she's built into her organization. But you could see in today's conversation, Liette is really driven, passionate, like I said, about entrepreneurship, and I think that you'll enjoy today's.
Super happy to be talking to you today. I know we've been trying to schedule this for a while, so I'm really happy you took the time sitting here in person. One of my first interviews in hopefully post-pandemic at Nobbin House. I guess first, just general broad question. Are you passionate about startups? Like, what is it exactly in your personality that leads you always back to like working, on startups and the ecosystem?
I'm passionate about entrepreneurs first, and that's really where it comes from. I've always been intrigued by entrepreneurs since I was very young. And if you look at my career, I've been working and supporting entrepreneurs in one way or another my whole life, basically. I started as a chartered accountant. Didn't last very long. I wasn't too excited about that. It lasted 3 years, but I've learned so much. And I realized that what I liked the most about being in a CPA office was getting to know entrepreneurs, getting into their business and learning the nuts and bolts of different industries. That's really something that's a passion, I would say. Learning about different industries, learning about how this specific business works. I love it.
Yeah, I can definitely relate. Obviously, I come from a consulting background.
Yes.
The firm I've been building, and there is this definite sense of just every time you meet a new company or an entrepreneur, you just learn something new. It's like this whole new playground.
A whole new world, yes.
I think what's different in your case is you're meeting entrepreneurs when they're at a very critical time in their lives. In the business life, hopefully not like in their personal lives as well, most likely. So I think that foundational moment, I imagine, is something that you spend time thinking about, where it's like, hey, we're at the first floor of a company, so the possibilities are endless. Have you given to any thought of that particular crucible moment in startups' lives and what's most important?
I really love meeting entrepreneurs when they're just starting up the business, and that's usually what I've been seeing in terms of entrepreneurs at the Fondation Montréal Inc. for years now, for 15 years now that I've been managing the foundation. And I like to learn what was the idea, where does the idea comes from, really. That's what I like about it, and how they're deciding to just change their whole life because of that idea, because they want to turn it into something real. And usually, or often, it is because they've seen a problem that they wish to solve, and they're willing to spend hours and weeks, and we know how much difficult it is to start a business. All that time they will put into bringing that idea to life. And that's something that I admire. I'm a huge admirer of startups and founders.
Yeah, I love this concept of you falling in love with people that have these ideas. And I think there's always this kind of it's painted as a dichotomous relationship, the person or the market or the idea. But I almost find it's more symbiotic. It's like the person and the idea go together. So if you're doing a weighted average of what's most important, I don't think there's an easy answer to this of how do you actually weight? Is it the person, their competence, their drive, or is it their idea they're going after? How do you think about it? Is there, a frame of reference that you use?
I like to see people that are passionate about something because their passion will really drive them. And so when the idea comes from you because you just are passionate about what you're seeing, we know then that you're going to do everything you can to make it happen. And when times will be rough, it will bring you back because you'll know how important it is for you. So the person and that passion that person has, I think that's really what makes the difference, especially in the first couple of years where everything you do, you have a new problem and a new obstacle, and you feel like people are always saying no to you, but you have to convince everyone that it's not a crazy idea. You need to be passionate about what you're doing in order to go through all those difficult steps. Yes, I think it's really as close as you can be to your idea, that's what's going to make a difference.
Yeah, you can't fake it. You have to really believe in it. It's not like...
You feel it when it's fake.
Do you find that, do you see that often, people that are in it more for the glory? The analogy I like to use is like back in the day, if you wanted to be a cool kid, it was a rock band. Now it's like sometimes maybe a few posers. Do you find is that the case, or is it you find more people are more good intentioned?
I tend to see good intentions in people, so I guess that's my view of the world. Of course, we do see some people that are there for the money or there for the challenge, and that's okay. That's okay too, because we need all kinds of people in a startup ecosystem to make it work. So I have no problem with this. I've been working a lot with women in those past couple of months because we have specific programs for women entrepreneurs, and I find that women, they usually start something because of a specific need and something that they're passionate about. Maybe more so than men. Yeah, I don't want to generalize, but I think it's something that we see more in women.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that way. You mentioned before about you've obviously been doing this for a while and you have a solid track record. The thing I always find hard when I talk to startups is because I always my disclaimer is always take this with a huge grain of salt because it's my grain of salt. Like it's very contextual to what I lived and what I've seen. And it might be the complete opposite of what you should be doing. And there's so many examples of that. How many people said to people that started, let's say Airbnb, that's a horrible idea, you shouldn't do this. And it's ended up being proven completely wrong. And a very credible investment. How do you think about advice at such early stage of companies? Like, do you give that same disclaimer? Or is there more like guiding principles, like you said, passion or things like this that you think are more evergreen?
I do give that disclaimer to every entrepreneur that we support. And I even make sure that we never have just one mentor for one entrepreneur. We try to surround them with many coaches and mentors, and we try to have them at the same time around the table at least one or twice, because then the entrepreneur can hear also the mentors or the coaches fighting their ideas and making sure that the best will come of it, but that they'll hear both sides of the story and they can then make their own judgment and make their own decision. To me, that's extremely important, especially for new entrepreneurs, someone who's never done that before, so they drink every opinion that they hear and they think it's the right one, but it's not necessarily. And yes, that's the way we operate. I've always been cautious with one mentor that is your guide and your solely guide, because he can be wrong, she can be wrong, and sometimes they can also be very directive and project themselves into the entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneur is different than themselves, and that person needs to make her or his own decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a good segue for you to talk about what is Startup Montreal and what you guys are building, your organization, and I think some recent news, obviously, that we could talk about as well.
Yes, so Startup Montreal was created from the merger of two nonprofit organizations. The first one is Montreal Inc. Foundation, which I said something about earlier. And Montreal Inc. has been around for 26 years. So there wasn't a startup ecosystem when Montreal was created. And there was not even an entrepreneurial ecosystem in Montreal, I would say. It was quite new at the time. And then Bonjour Startup Montréal was created by Montreal Inc. It was co-founded by Fondation Montréal Inc. and OSMO Foundation. We're in Notman House, and it is owned and managed by OSMO Foundation. So the two of us created Bonjour Startup Montréal because we both wanted to have more impact in the startup ecosystem. And we saw that ecosystem, which is still very young. Montreal has maybe 10 years of existence in terms of startup ecosystem, that now was the time maybe to look at our strengths, our weaknesses, and see how we can make that ecosystem more performing better, and how we could also promote it outside of Montreal. So Montreal Inc. and Bonjour Startup merged at the beginning of this year in 2022, and we created Startup Montreal. So obviously we went through a whole strategic planning phase where we had to look at those two organizations, see what we should continue in terms of services and initiatives, what we should stop doing because it didn't make sense anymore. And we ended up with our new mission, our new vision for Startup Montreal, which is, I would say, Montreal Inc. was more into direct services to entrepreneurs. Bonjour Startup more into making the ecosystem stronger and better. So we took the best of Montreal Inc. and what we've learned from it, and we said, how can we bring that small ecosystem that we created at Montreal Inc., which is a philanthropic organization, how can we scale it to the whole ecosystem? Because what we've been doing at Montreal Inc., for example, is building a network of coaches that are volunteers that come and help entrepreneurs. We have 450 women and men that are giving their time for entrepreneurs. So how could they possibly help more entrepreneurs than just the one that we were helping at Montreal Inc.? So that's one thing that we're trying to build now at Startup Montreal. And the whole notion of giving back. Whenever someone got a grant from Montreal Inc., they would sign a social contract with us saying, okay, now I get this grant because the business community is funding Montreal Inc. Foundation. They believe in me, and when I'll have success, it will be my turn to give back to that community for the next entrepreneurs to come. And so we're also trying to give that notion of giving back and making this a reflex into the whole startup ecosystem. So that's the way we brought together the two missions to make our startup ecosystem stronger. That's the plan, at least.
Yeah, and I definitely love the plan. Like you mentioned, I think it's about having a bigger impact, making the ecosystem more robust. So a few questions on this front. So how do you think about working with other key ecosystem players, incubators, accelerators, I imagine investors, or meta organizations like Maine? Just curious as to how you see your role in terms of empowering the entire ecosystem.
Yes, that's a good question. We have 5 big objectives with Startup Montreal, and the first one is how do we make this ecosystem more collaborative? So obviously we need everyone. It's a small ecosystem, and we will never be Silicon Valley, and that's not what we're aiming for, but how can we be stronger? And the only way to do that is to work together more closely. And it's normal. As I said, it's a young ecosystem. So those past 10 years, we've seen lots of new accelerators being created, lots of new activities, new funds, new VCs, and that's great because now there are so many options for the entrepreneurs. But we cannot continue to just create new organizations. We need to work together. So that's one of the role of Startup Montreal, is to bring all those players together and make them realize that, oh, you're building a specific program for women entrepreneurs, but I'm also building one. So why don't we do this together, and then we can have more impact? Because the reality is the organizations in Montreal are quite small, and they don't have that many resources. So we need to share our resources better. And one of those resources is our own expertise and understanding of the ecosystem as well. We need to share that. We need to come together and see what's missing and put our effort into what's missing and stop doing the things that are maybe already done in a great way by somebody else and accept that, okay, I'm going to focus on this part instead because other players are doing a good job at doing this. So that's a way to better use our resources, both financial and human resources, because those are also missing these days.
It's like a key lesson. What's the expression in French? L'union fait la force.
Yeah.
So exactly. You guys have proven it by merging, but also in terms of your philosophy with ecosystem, right? We're too small as an ecosystem, like even comparatively to our neighbors in Ontario, we have a lot of catching up to do. So then maybe if you look at your own SWOT, what would be your strengths that you're like, hey, like we need to double down in terms of this is what we do well?
Yeah, I think the ecosystem is now at a place where pretty much everyone understands that we need to collaborate more. So the need is clear. People want it. The difficulty is how do we, so that's where we are. We talk about co-petition. We're not exactly collaborating yet. We're more into a mode where we just try to find the best way to do that. Anyway, in terms of what we're doing, we have strength here in our ecosystem. We're located at a place where it's like between the United States, and we're a good gateway from Europe for Europeans, for example, that would like to come and work in Montreal. We're a gateway to North America. It's an easy way for the French-speaking community. We see a lot of French people coming here to work in the startup ecosystem. So we have many, I think, advantages to attract talent. We're creating talent because we have great universities. We know it's not enough these days, so we also need to attract talents from outside. And I think Montreal is in a good position to do that because of the lifestyle, because of, being part of North America as well. The cost of living are still pretty affordable here. So those are the main strengths that we see and that we like to promote. That's the way we talk about Montreal when we present it to the outside world.
Yeah, so lots of reasons for optimism.
Yeah.
Any more key assets, or you mentioned some more structural, like you mentioned our location, cost of living, but more in terms of talent or universities? So curious to get your perspective. Everyone talks about our university ecosystem and obviously deep technical talent, but I'd love to get someone that's in the trenches working day to day in this and thinking about the ecosystem. What's the deeper level of insight that you maybe been able to uncover about, hey, there's some real advantages to this market?
What we're seeing more and more these days is more collaborations between universities and organizations in the ecosystem. Each university now has its accelerator. If you go back 5 or 6 years ago, which is not very far, the universities had entrepreneurial centers, that's what they called them. And usually the top of the university would look down on the entrepreneurial centers because they did not quite understand what they were doing and they didn't see much value there. That has changed so much in 5 or 6 years because now each university has a startup accelerator. They're proud of it. They're putting money into it. They're promoting it. So it's a game changer, I think, for our ecosystem to have those accelerators that are now well looked upon by the universities. And that gives them, I think, more power also to make us bridge the gap that we see between the students and the startups, because that's what we need to do. We need to convince more of those students to go work into the startup ecosystem. And that's not an easy one because obviously they have offers for jobs from bigger companies that have bigger salaries. We all know the drill. So I see a lot of hope in the accelerators, the universities' accelerators, to help us do that better in the coming years. And we already see things coming. So I think it's a matter of months and not years anymore. If we look at more structural also aspects of our ecosystem and recent signals, positive signals that we've got, the governments. It used to be that our governments did not understand what startups were about either. And whenever they talked about economic development, entrepreneurs were not part of it. Startups were definitely not part of it. I remember as general manager of Montreal Inc. Foundation, I used to go and sit with the person responsible for the economic development at the City of Montreal each year. That was like 10 years ago, just to ask them, why don't you mention anything about entrepreneurs in your strategy? You're developing an economic development strategy for the City of Montreal, yet you don't consider entrepreneurs. How is that possible? And they would laugh at me because it didn't make sense for them. But now we're really past that point. The City of Montreal has someone, a director specifically for entrepreneuriat, that's what it's called in French. That person was nominated three years ago, I think, if I recall. And our own Quebec government has an innovation council that was launched. They're working on a new strategy for innovation. We are beginning to speak the same language. We don't have to work at convincing them as much as we used to that it's important to invest in startups. And we see all sorts of new things coming. There's a new law that's being also, that's on the work in terms of public access to public markets. And startups are considered within that law. They want to make things easier for startups to be able to access public markets. So those are the structural changes that I really like to see now. We can feel that it's really changing.
Yeah, you answered one of my questions about what can we improve. It was going to be one of my subsequent follow-on questions, and it sounds like a lot of it has to come with like external help, structural improvement, because we have the talent, we have the resources, but there seems to be like more help needed. And I think players like Startup Montreal are this accelerator, which I really find inspiring. How do you see it? I'm curious to think about to ask you about how you think about your role as managing director. Is it a role? Is it a cheerleader? Is it more like a wartime CEO, like breaking down walls? I'm curious to hear you about like your position.
I am so not the cheerleader type. Really not. That's not a role I would like to play. I see myself as bringing people together and make them work in the same direction. And that really is the most difficult task that Startup Montreal has, because again, if we do have this mission to reinforce the ecosystem, but it's impossible for us to do it alone. Impossible. We won't accomplish anything if we try to do it alone. So I have to gather all the energy and all the partners I can get into the equation. And it's not easy because they all each have their own mission, and they all have scarce resources, taking some of their time. It's difficult. It's a difficult ask, but that's what we're doing. So it's really about mobilizing people in the ecosystem, finding the ones that are willing to work the extra mile with us because they think it's important, and they're not just doing this for their own mission, but they also think that it's worth spending extra time on helping Startup Montreal build that ecosystem. Because Startup Montreal is not doing things for Startup Montreal. We're really doing it for the startup ecosystem. That's all that matters to us. And so that's my role. And it takes humility, I would say, because you need to extend your hand to people and say, I need you. I can't do this alone. It's much easier to do things alone when you're a manager, because here's my budget, here's my action plan, and let's execute. Well, I can't execute alone. I have my team, but I need more than that. I need a lot more players in the ecosystem to work. So we even built it into our strategic planning that we would not do one initiative, not one new program or service without making sure that we have other people, other players in the ecosystem on it with us. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. It has to be a collective effort. It just cannot be something that we do on our own. And it has become something that everyone has to follow within our organization. You never do something, we never launch anything. We always co-create. And we always make sure that we have the input, but also that we will have people in the ecosystem working with us in delivering that new initiative or that new program. Otherwise, we just don't do it.
Yes, listening to you speak, and I find it such an interesting role that you have, like a CEO, where it's not the classic top-down approach. Not that the classic top-down approach works that much anymore, but particularly in your case, where it's almost like an organism. You need to have a much more collaborative aspect to what you're doing, and getting buy-in from all the different stakeholders, starting with your team. So maybe an esoteric question about how you think about values, right? You mentioned collaboration.
Yes.
Curious to hear what else you value as important.
Collaboration is really the first one. Ambition is another one, because we want entrepreneurs to have ambition. We want them to look not just at the Montreal market, not just at the Quebec market, not just the Canadian market, but also the international markets. And we see that's a bit of a weakness that we have here in Montreal. Entrepreneurs are not going global as quickly as we see in other ecosystems. It's probably easier when you're in Europe and you're a small country in Europe and the rest of Europe is right there at your feet, almost. But still, that's ambition for the entrepreneurs and ambition for our ecosystem, something that we could share as a value in the ecosystem. Agility. We think that we need to mimic what the entrepreneurs are doing. So we admire the way that they can be so agile. So we need to work the same way, otherwise it doesn't work. We need to speak the same language and learn from them also. So that's another one. Then what else do we have? We have transparency. I think it's necessary if you want people to work with you, that they understand where you're going and that you're very transparent about what works, what doesn't work. We also have public funds. We get grants from the Quebec government and the City of Montreal, so transparency is key. We're doing new things. We're doing things that have never been done in the ecosystem, so we will make mistakes. We have made mistakes with Bonjour Startup Montréal. We've tried things, they didn't work. So if you want your founders to follow, you need to be transparent and you need to have that conversation that, you know what, it's not going to work all the time, but I'm going to tell you the risks and we will take them together. So transparency is really key. And then the last one, what is it? Oh, it's enjoyment. We got to have fun doing this because it's tough. And yeah, we spend so much time at work, so it has to be enjoyable.
That's a good value. I like that one. And maybe a question from left field, but what's most misunderstood about the ecosystem? What are the myths that you always have?
That's an interesting question. I think we tend to, and we touched on it, we tend to think that Silicon Valley should be our benchmark, and it's not. I like to look at Amsterdam, I like to look at Barcelona, because they're much smaller startup ecosystem, and they're also younger, and we need to compare ourselves to ecosystems that are about the same age as we are, or just a little bit ahead of us, to really understand or really see the best practices that could be applied here. Yeah. The other thing I would to mention is we cannot be Silicon Valley in terms of how big it is, but we cannot be Silicon Valley also because of the values that we have here. And they're different from the one we see in Silicon Valley. And that's also my hope for this startup ecosystem, is that we find our own path, that we do things the way that feel in accordance with our values, because that's how we will win. That's how we will we will be stronger and better. It has to resemble us. It has to be something that we feel is us. And I think our ecosystem cannot differentiate itself by just trying to be bigger and have more funding. It's not the way it's going to work. It has to differentiate itself by its value, by the fact that many entrepreneurs here are trying to solve problems that are that are often social problems, health problems, and not, yes, businesses that are often built around impact, not just economic impact, but social impact, environmental impact as well. And another thing that I would like to see in the ecosystem, and I'm not just saying that because I think it's important, but we had consultations with the actors in the ecosystem in 2020. We had an offsite, we called it an offsite, it was a virtual one, and we had 75 different actors from the ecosystem, stakeholders. And they voted on what this ecosystem should be. And the first thing that came out is we need an ecosystem where we can really make work really have social impact and economic impact working together. It cannot be two different things and we just manage them like they're two different things. We have to find a way to bring them together. That was the first one, so that's an important value. And the other one was we need an ecosystem that's diverse and inclusive. And that's also, I think, the second way that Montreal could be different from other ecosystems and attract talent and attract people that want to live this way as founders.
Yeah, it's a very ambitious goal that you set out.
You think?
I think so. It's also one I think that's worth working towards. I was looking at your website and your 2030 goal. I was curious as to how you measure success. You said it's not necessarily in quantity, but in quality.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the KPIs on your dashboard? I'd be curious to...
We're working on this as we speak. I had a meeting earlier today on how do we measure that social impact that we want in the startup ecosystem. And we're not going to decide on those measures alone. So the next step really is to do that. We have a task force. We have a task force on impact that we started last year. And we're planning the next meeting with them. And the first item on the agenda is what would be one good measure that we would like, that we would all agree on? What would be one KPI that we could all agree on? And let's do this progressively. It's not going to be, we need to make small steps in order to get there, even though we're ambitious. Because if we try to measure everything, people are just going to push back on it. It's not fun having to compile data. It could be fun. A lot of people like doing this. But if we ask from the stakeholders in the ecosystem to just give us data all the time, it's not the right way, I think, to mobilize them. So that's for the impact. And in terms of diversity, we are measuring it as we speak because there is a survey going on right now. I think we launched it at the beginning of this week. It's going to founders and executives in the startups in Montreal, and we're asking them how diverse they are as a team of founders, but also the employees in their startups, because we think we are diverse ecosystem in Montreal, but I want to see where we're starting from. And from there, we'll be able to say, okay, this is it. We'll publish this. We'll make sure everyone knows how diverse we are. And then we'll decide together where do we want to go from there. How much diverse can we be? And what kinds of action are we all willing to take? Because again, it's a collective effort.
Yeah, it goes back to, I think, measuring what matters, right? What you're saying.
Yes.
It's not just measuring for measuring's sake, but
no.
What's really important, how do we make diversity top of the agenda? Going back to impact, I love that point you said. It's not just, yes, capital revenues, all these things, but what's the purpose of the company? Is there actual social benefit to it? So that definitely, touches my heartstrings.
Yeah, and there's the Global Startup Ecosystem Report that is being published each year by Startup Genome. We're a member of Startup Genome. And they rank startup ecosystems around the world, and they tell us how we're doing on many different KPIs, way too many as far as I'm concerned, but that's interesting. And we like to see that report. We get excited about it. Right now Montreal is on the 36th in terms of ranking. Of course, it's one way to measure ourselves, and it's an external measure, so it's an interesting one. But I don't want this to be our only measure. We need our own. So that's why we're working on that measure for the impact and for diversity, because that's one we can bring people around, I think. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Liette, I've loved our conversation. I've like so much more to learn. I find like I'm going to link to some of these resources you mentioned in the show notes. My final question for you: if people want to learn more, participate in the ecosystem,
they can reach out to me, of course. Liette@startupmontreal.com. We have a Slack community, which is amazing. Really, lots of opportunities out there, so I encourage everyone to just go and join our Slack community. We communicate with people on that Slack community as well. And there's our newsletter, because we like, and of course our social media, but our newsletter is great. We communicate on opportunities, we communicate on everything that's going on in the startup ecosystem. So I think that's the starting point for anyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Don't miss an episode by subscribing on iTunes or Google Play.